over-the-top horror? Do you like body horror? Do you like gross special effects?
Do you like raw, unfiltered, in-your-face, unapologetic looks and the horrific toll that the way women are treated as they get older takes on our mental health and the things that it makes us feel like we need to do to have value to society?
Do you like boobs? Then this movie is for you. I am very normal about this movie. Extremely normal. I stand by this truth. If you're a person who has triggers that are common horror tropes, you should always check this website before seeing any horror film. Here is, in my opinion, the list of potential triggering things in this movie. You have been warned. Please understand that I am the target audience for this film in so many ways. I don't just mean that I'm the right demographic. I mean that I am a sucker for this type of cinematography. I will devour this brand of sound design. I adore shrieking at gross out body horror moments. But also a horror movie written and directed by a woman about a very real struggle that women go through, and a perspective that we don't see on the screen nearly ever, in large part due to the idea that older women don't hold the same value as our younger counterparts. If you want a play-by-play through the plot of this film is just not the most interesting way to discuss it. But if you haven't seen the movie yet, or if it's been a bit, here is a quick sum up. If you don't need this, please skip ahead. The chapter markers are down in the description. Elizabeth Sparkle is a jazzercise model who helms her own television show, so popular and famous that she has her own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. On her 50th birthday, she is fired from her job because she's 50, and that's when it stops.
What stops?
To be replaced by someone younger and therefore, by her producer's opinion, prettier, sexier, and more fuckable. She gets into a car accident and meets a nurse who gives her this USB drive that tells her about the substance, a substance that will create a better version of herself. Desperate to reclaim her value to the industry and to herself, she goes for it. She takes it. The rules are simple. Activate. Stabilize. Switch every 7 days. No exception. You are one. It literally creates a new her, a younger version of herself who rips out of her back. It is still Elizabeth. They share the same brain, the same consciousness largely. We'll get to that later. To stabilize, she must extract spinal fluid from Elizabeth's body and give it to herself. She auditions for her old job using a new name, Sue, and is instantly hired and finds immediate, huge success by being young, pretty, and...
Everything sure is in the right place this time.
So at first, she switches like she should. But after being hot and young, Elizabeth cannot stand for people to even perceive her in public. She spends her whole week locked in her apartment, eating her feelings, and watching crappy television, just generally being miserable. Things start to go downhill pretty fast. Sue takes a few more hours than she's supposed to before she switches so that she can bang a dude. And when Elizabeth wakes up, it's taken a visible toll on her body. Her finger has not only aged, but aged badly. It looks gnarly. She calls the mysterious number to ask for help and is told
Remember, there is no she and you. You are one.
And that anything that is taken cannot be put back. What's gone is gone. And that everything will be fine if she respects the balance. She's really struggling to find value in her older self and to feel like she deserves to be loved. Her self-loathing is just skyrocketing. And after a particularly intense bout of self-destruction as Elizabeth, Sue decides to stop switching back at all. She's given the chance to host this coveted New Year's Eve show and completely drains Elizabeth of stabilizer fluid and goes whole hog into her very hedonistic lifestyle. And as one can easily predict, she runs out of fluid the night before the New Year's Eve special. She calls the number only to be told that the only way to get more fluid is to switch back and allow the fluid to regenerate.
No. I can't.
Desperate, she does this, and Elizabeth comes back looking about 150 years old. Elizabeth decides to stop. This is not okay. This went too far. Sue is out of control. Sue's taking everything. So she tries to terminate Sue. She then panics and regrets it about halfway through the process and tries to switch back to Sue after giving her most of the termination fluid. This ends up waking Sue up while Elizabeth is still conscious. And then Sue brutally murders Elizabeth, which is saying something when you consider they are the same person. So she goes on to do the New Year's Eve show, but she starts to deteriorate before she goes out on stage. So she panics again and remembers that she still has Activator left at home. So she runs there and tries to once again create a better version of herself. But what comes out instead is a horribly deformed monstrosity. She gets dressed regardless and ends up making herself an Elizabeth Sparkle mask out of this painting that she has in her apartment and goes to host the show, which becomes a horrible bloodbath and ends with what's left of Elizabeth dissolving into gore on top of her star on the Walk of Fame. Everything in this film is extremely intentional, especially how over the top it is. This film is not subtle. It does not want to be subtle. It laughs at your expectation that it should in any way be subtle. If you prefer the messaging in your horror films to be more discreet, something you need to really ponder about to truly grasp or really analyze to see what message it's trying to give you, you're going to be very disappointed. Honestly, I typically make fun of movies that feel like they need to brain you over the head with the message of the film. I usually feel like it's insulting to the audience, like we aren't smart enough to figure it out without someone looking directly into the camera and saying, "This is about how capitalism is bad," which is not what this movie is about. It's just an example. But this movie isn't doing that. It doesn't think we're stupid. It just doesn't want to give us a chance to look away. It's over the top so that you are forced to be witness to what is happening. I knew that I was going to love this movie in this scene. Now, this is the second scene, so I was all in very early on. Elizabeth is in a stall of the men's room, and her producer comes in, and we have to watch him from this awful angle on a very wide lens that makes his features really distorted, and the sound design that lets us hear every gross mouth noise. He comes in and talks about how at 50, Elizabeth isn't attractive anymore, so the irony is just immediately there, right? I fell in love. Fuck subtle. His name is Harvey, for Pete's sake. Very on the nose, right? So why did they decide to cave in your skull with the message of this movie? So first, I feel like this is a direct middle finger to the idea that women should be any type of thing. Should that be demure? Should be proper? Should be poised and polite? I suppose they can make horror, but if they do, it needs to be smart and cerebral and subtle. And there's nothing wrong with those types of films. But this film says, fuck your expectations. I'm going to be loud. I'm going to be gross. And I'm going to be in your face about it. And you cannot ignore me. Society, and especially the entertainment industry, treats women over 40 like they don't exist. They vanish when they hit perimenopause, if not sooner. So this film puts a bullhorn next to your ear and makes you notice them. Second, the underlying horror conceit of this film is very specific. The reason that horror can be so difficult of a genre to do well is because not everyone is afraid of the same things. So for example, when I was writing my first horror short about a photographer who was losing her vision, my screenwriting professor, who I adore, don't get me wrong, said to me, "Okay, but what is it really about? Because no one is afraid of going blind." And I was so aggravated because I was scared of that thing. I have had vision issues since I was a kid. I have had multiple eye surgeries, and I'm a visual artist. That's why I based the movie on it. but it wasn't a fear that he could relate to. The core fear the substance is playing on is something that most women over 35 will get immediately. But the main demographic that goes to see horror movies isn't women over 35, as much as I hate to say that. It's just not. But that does not mean the movie shouldn't be made, and if you think that,
I don't give a fuck.
But what it does mean is that the movie needs to make the horror real for everyone, while staying true to the message. It needs to slap you in the face because it can't rely on your shared experience to communicate the horror and the story. And I don't think that's the only reason that they decided to go with an over-the-top, very bloody, very visceral body horror. I don't really think they looked at this story and went, this is how we get the teenage boys to watch. I do think that it was also a creative choice based on the story itself. But I really do think that a big part of that was making the horror real and really hammering that message home to people who aren't going to just click with it immediately. And I think this can be summed up with one question. Which scene made you squirm the most? Because for me, it wasn't any of the body horror scenes. Like, yes, those are horrifying, don't get me wrong. But it was the scene where Elizabeth is trying to get ready for her date with Fred and keeps going back to the bathroom to change her look. It was so difficult for me to watch her go through that. I thought at one point it was going to shift into body horror. She rubbed at her skin like she'd start to tear it, but it didn't because it did not need to. That scene was for us, the women who get it. It didn't need blood or gore to make me sick to my stomach, to make me yell at the screen. It was just very raw and very real. Like, I have had those feelings before where no matter what I do, every time I look in the mirror, I just feel ugly. The film makes the over-the-top absurdity and the somewhat surreal nature the core of its style. This is also why I found the sledgehammer messaging doesn't feel out of place, because that's not the only thing it does to create a sense of subjectivity. The film also takes you outside of time, where you question what decade it's supposed to be shot in. This is part of making the larger-than-life nature of the film feel consistent, so that it is all of those things I already talked about, but it is also a stylistic choice. The film is surreal. So the garish messaging, the overly loud Foley sounds, the distorted visuals, and the off-the-wall ending all come together to feel very cohesive. At first, it seems like the movie is set in the 70s or the 80s with the fashions and the hallway decor and the dance moves and the fact that she's a jazzercise coach. But then she's given a USB drive, her television is a flat screen, and she's got a smartphone. When she flips to Sue, it's even more modern day. The workout show totally changes, featuring more modern music, more modern choreography, and more modern camera work. It's another way that the movie is communicating to you that Elizabeth is old and Sue is young. I want to talk a moment about another movie that tried to do this and failed. I found myself comparing a lot of the moments in this to Neon Demon, a movie that bluntly I hated. A movie about a model who just had something that the other models didn't have, leading them to murder her in a fit of cannibalistic jealousy. The treatment of Sue here is similar in a way. She blows people away immediately. She's a star the moment she walks into the room. Harvey will do anything to have her be the face of his show. But it feels so much more believable here than in Neon Demon, a movie that also had its foot in the realm of absurdity. In that film, I felt like they were constantly telling me that she was special and somehow more beautiful than all the other women, but I never really saw it. They just kept saying it over and over and over and over again, like they had to convince me. All the women in that movie were gorgeous, so the comparisons just fell really, really flat every single time. And the actor doesn't have a unique enough look for me to buy it. She is beautiful, but so is this actor and this one and this one. And while she does have a more girl next door look about her, the others don't feel like the plastic photocopies the movie tries to make them out to be. The actor playing Sue is also not any more gorgeous than countless other actors and models, But the key difference here is that the movie isn't asking you to compare her to other women. In fact, in her audition, you never even see the other woman's face. You only are comparing her to her older self. And so it works in a way that Neon Demon decidedly did not. Again, I typically don't like it when films use nudity just for the sake of titillation. But like everything in the substance, the nudity is important to the story. First, I want to address Demi Moore. Y'all, sometimes I can't even look in a mirror without feeling like a gross troll and seeing every wrinkle on my face that was not there 5 years ago. But the fact that Demi Moore was brave enough, and yes, I am using brave because it fucking is, to let them film her in clothes and makeup and lighting that made her look as old as possible blows me away. To not only be fully nude on camera, but to do it in a scene that directly compares your 61-year-old body to that of a woman in her 20s. Good God, Demi Moore is my new hero. Nudity in the bathroom is so different from the gratuitous shots we have when Sue is filming her workout show. It's way more matter of fact. It's not really sexualized at all. It's just nudity, bodies. It's not filmed from like a male gaze perspective. It's filmed more or less objectively. Do Sue and Elizabeth have to be naked when they switch? No, but it adds to the dehumanization that Elizabeth is putting herself through with her own self-loathing. Now, we go to Sue on set, and it's not even full-on nudity, and it is sexualized as hell. It's very specifically shot with a male gaze, even though it's a show that is ostensibly being produced for women. They have a specific camera that only films her ass. I didn't count, but it wouldn't surprise me if there are more shots of her body than her face in all of the workout show sequences. I love how they handled the sexualization in this movie. You could, and people have, make a whole film about this topic, multiple films. But that's not what we're focusing on here. That is not the point of the movie. Would it be easy to have Harvey be gross and hit on Sue and get sexually aggressive? Absolutely. I expected it, honestly. They freaking named him Harvey. This isn't a movie about how young women are sexually harassed and exploited. It's a movie about how older women are devalued and driven to devalue themselves as they age. It wants to show the positive parts of being young and hot, the same way that women tend to idolize those years as we get older. At the end, they go so far as to make the nudity disgusting, with the monster vomiting up a breast attached to an umbilical cord on the stage, even as the backup dancers stood topless and perfect all around her. I am a huge sound nerd. I taught film sound classes to undergrads for a while. The opening shot of this movie made me giddy because of the sound effects. Typically, Foley sounds, which are the sound effects that are recorded in sync with the picture in editing, like footsteps and, cutting meat and the sound of a cup being placed on a table when an actor sets it down, they're all usually very subtle sounds. You don't overtly notice them unless they're absent. But what do we know about this movie and subtlety? They go hard in the paint on their sound effects. Mouth noises? Smack those lips. Eating noises?
It's inevitable. At 50, well.
Chew on the microphone. Skin ripping? Turn it up to 11. This is actually pretty common in body horror-centric films. Body horror is at least half, if not more, in the sound design. Yes, it looks gross when someone tears a chunk of skin off, but it feels gross when you can hear the ripping, tearing, and squelching of that gore. Loud Foley sounds, partnered with extreme close-ups, also turn otherwise mundane actions into something disgusting. Watching and hearing Harvey tear into those prawns made me sick to my stomach. It was one of the grosser scenes in the movie.
People just love that.
I have a couple of friends who, when we are working on set together and they know that I will be doing the sound editing, will periodically make disgusting mouth noises into the boom mic between takes, for me to discover later when I'm editing. True friendship. Yeah. Cranking up the effects also helps lend that feeling of surrealism. The sounds are no longer objective. They're too loud to be taken literally. There's even instances where they use the incorrect sound effect because it's not meant to be taken literally. The soundscape becomes subjective, another lens that we can view Elizabeth's rapid decline into self-loathing and self-destruction. Sometimes the sound goes wonky and we're shoved directly into Elizabeth or Sue's perception. And the sound is muffled and strange and really highlights her mental space, especially when she's switching between the two bodies, which has to be a very jarring process, right? It also means that even if you look away, you're still forced to survive the onslaught of audio from the scene. And the audio by itself is often just as disgusting, if not more so, than the visuals. I have a friend who had to leave the theater early despite really enjoying the film because the just constant barrage of visual and auditory madness was just too overwhelming. And if you're also someone who struggles with misophonia, the sound design of this movie will wreck you. They also don't futz the voice on the phone for the company providing the substance. So futzing is when you take the audio and you make it sound like it's coming from like a radio or a phone or a speaker.
Write this down. 35 North Byron Alley.
You are the Matrix. If you are not satisfied, you can put an end to the experience.
The voice that provides the substance isn't really given that treatment. So it sounds and feels very untethered from reality. Like we see her on the phone, but the voice doesn't sound like it's coming from the phone. So when we're nearing the end of the film and the voice becomes entirely disembodied and disconnected from the phone calls, it really only sounds louder rather than more surreal, right? It's just one more detail added in to help support this feeling of being stuck in Elizabeth's head, experiencing her mental deterioration in real time.
Editing Heather here. After watching the movie again as I made this edit, I realized that the way that I characterized the sound in this section is not entirely accurate. They do futz the audio in the first phone call, and they futz it a little bit in a couple of the other calls. It's not necessarily true that it goes from completely futzed to not futzed in a linear manner throughout the plot, but it is accurate to say that they play with the futzing on the voice quite a bit to really lend to the sense of surrealism throughout the film.
So I'm a sucker for bold visuals. I can certainly appreciate more complex visual motifs, but I really enjoy clean, bold cinematography. And this movie does not disappoint. Every single frame is intentional. And this style of very modern framing with the very clean lines and distinct areas of contrast, as well as the choice to film certain characters almost exclusively in extreme angles and distorted close-ups, supports, again, the surreal feeling of the movie. The stark nature of the bathroom and the dark void of the closet where Sue hides Elizabeth away and the ridiculous bird's eye shot at the end. There's no attempt or desire to create shots that portray life realistically, with, a few notable exceptions. The way they shoot and style the back alley where Elizabeth has to go to pick up her refills of the substance is at such a distinct contrast to the rest of the film. The alleyway is dingy and gross, and it's shot in like a very standard wide shot. Compare the alley to, say, like the closet or the hallway. It's seen as very mundane, not a place that you would usually look at, right? And that's how it's shot. because that's what it's supposed to be in the story. The cinematography is just beautiful, and it's another part of the storytelling. So, for example, the difference between how Elizabeth's show is shot at the beginning of the movie to how they shoot Sue's show. The camera work is telling a story here. The close-ups that they use do the same thing. It's way more visceral to watch Sue sew up Elizabeth's back in extreme close-up than in a wide shot. We feel how gross and disgusting Elizabeth is being, and therefore how self-destructive when she cooks all that French food, because the camera focuses on the gross parts. Getting right up in there, she shoves her hand into a raw chicken and slurps it around a whole bunch. The writer-director is French, which I feel explains quite a bit about this movie, but I also found it kind of funny that she uses French cooking specifically for that scene I just referenced. And specifically like the kind of grosser dishes, like the foie gras, which I know I am not saying correctly, don't come after me, which is delicious, but it's not at all aesthetic to me. So Harvey is constantly being portrayed in a shot that is like warped and distorted and tells us that he's supposed to be a caricature. The way we view him is from Elizabeth's perspective, or Sue's, and the exaggerated nature of those shots tells us that this man isn't real, right? He's a stand-in for a concept. And his portrayal is directly tied to Elizabeth or Sue's current state when she interacts with him. At the lunch where Elizabeth knows she's being fired, he's shot like this. But when Sue is being given great things and she's on the top of the world, he's shot much more objectively. And then when Sue is beginning to fall apart, we have this.
That's what we want tonight!
Which goes from surrealist throughout the film to downright absurdist at the end. As the main character's mental state erodes, the camera follows that path and helps support that story until the last act, where things go completely batshit insane and nothing is objective anymore. The way it used shots and sound reminded me a lot of Requiem for a Dream, especially the close-ups of the needle going into Elizabeth's back over and over. Requiem used a similar type of surrealism, especially when dealing with the mother character, who was obsessed about getting on television and drove herself into a mental breakdown trying to diet her way into looking better for her game show appearance. There's several places that feel very inspired by Requiem, including the aforementioned needle shot, the eye shot, and just the vibe of Elizabeth's decline as she sits on the couch watching game shows and feeling inadequate.
Moving about. I hunt through the text.
The effects in this film are almost entirely practical. And man, does that make a difference. So practical means that they actually created the props and the prosthetics rather than relying on digital post-production to create the look. There is a thing that happens with effects when they're done in post-production digitally where they just aren't as impactful. We are very good at being able to tell when certain types of effects, especially ones that deform a human body, are digitally created. And that level of intuitive understanding means that we are kind of automatically less connected to what is happening on the screen because the "that's not real" part of our brain is firing, that uncanny valley feeling. Practical effects aren't real either, but they are real in the sense that the prosthetics actually exist. I can touch them. The actor is actually poking something. It's not the thing it's made to look like, right? Demi Moore doesn't actually have a gash in her back, but the prosthetic is a real thing. And I firmly believe that if you're going to do body horror well, it needs to be largely practical. This director's commitment to doing the body horror practically is one of the biggest reasons this film works as well as it does. They spent just as much time, energy, and detail on this part of the film as the rest of the film. Some of those prosthetics took up to 6 hours to apply to the talent, meaning they only got a couple hours of filming time once the application process was done. So according to an interview, the director looked for a long time for a designer that wasn't going to make everything look too masculine. The monster at the end, for example, she's quoted as saying that she wanted it to be a Picasso of male expectations. So even at her most horrifying and surreal, Sue was still an amalgamation of like awful beauty standards, just ones that had gone very, very wrong. While I personally struggle to see what the designer means when he says that he's trying to put a level of grace and elegance into many of the prosthetics, I can certainly see how that intent shaped the creations that were different than what I'm used to seeing. I would never have used the word graceful on any of these, but they certainly weren't typical. But the prosthetics weren't just used to make gross out body horror. They were also used to communicate the idealized beauty of Sue. So Sue's actress wore prosthetic breasts in the nude scenes so that they could make her boobs look completely and utterly perfect. And man, I would be lying if I said that I didn't think to myself, Jesus, those tits, when Sue was first revealed, because good grief, who actually has natural breasts like that? Turns out they were also fake, just not in the way that we're used to thinking about breast augmentation. And I kind of love this. The fact that there are two parts to this film that are made based on unreal and unbelievable things, that the body horror and the perfection were both manufactured, adds a level of meta lore to this film that just makes it more perfect. The shots in the finale where the audience is being sprayed with blood and we're in Sue's point of view, they used 30,000 gallons of fake blood sprayed from a fire hose. And the director sprayed it herself while holding the camera, and I have never heard about something I want to accomplish more in my life than that. While Elizabeth and Sue are said to be the same person, they start acting more and more like different people as the movie goes on. The voice on the phone constantly reminds them that there is no she. They are one.
She just...
But the more they switch, the more the other version doesn't seem to remember what they did while in the other body. I think it's a really interesting way to portray the mental anguish that Elizabeth is going through. It's obviously taken to an extreme, but I liken it to having a night where the depression hits really hard and you say, fuck everything and binge eat your feelings and go to bed. And then waking up in the next morning, seeing and feeling the consequences of that and being like, God, why did I do that? When Elizabeth is cooking and watching Sue on the talk show, she already knows how Sue is going to answer the question because she is Sue. Her watching that show is an act of self-destruction and self-harm because she knows it's going to upset her and she does it anyway. She knows that what she said won't change. She is trying to hurt herself because she hates herself. The reason Elizabeth has such a hard time letting go of Sue and refusing to end the cycle is because she does experience what Sue experiences. She's not just unconscious on the floor. She is living two lives. She gets to feel the adoration and the fame and all of the good things, which is why switching back is so hard. If she wasn't experiencing the good things, there wouldn't be an internal conflict about killing Sue. Even in the last act, when Sue and Elizabeth are both awake at the same time and Sue flies into a rage and brutally beats Elizabeth to death, they are still the same person. We just watched her kill herself on screen, albeit in a more subjective and surrealist way. So these are things that I loved that didn't really fit neatly into any of the other categories, but that I was so impressed with that I just have to talk about. I can see an argument being made that using someone as gorgeous as Demi Moore for this film makes it less relatable or believable. She is beautiful. Most of us will have nothing close to the body she has at 61 when we reach that age. But that's kind of the point. She's gorgeous and is still being erased. She is beautiful and still struggles with feeling like she has value because she's not 25 anymore. She is lovely and gets replaced by someone who doesn't need flesh-colored tights to conceal cellulite. Hell, they even use Fred to hammer this home.
You're still the most beautiful girl in the whole wide world.
He thinks she's the most beautiful woman in the world, and he's so excited to take her on a date. But she is just too deep into her own self-loathing to be able to accept that from him, even though she so desperately wants to. That fucking door, the door that never comes all the way up. No, you have to crouch to go in. You don't get to walk into this place with your head held high. This is a place you only go if you hate yourself. So hunch. Skulk into the white, pristine interior to get your juice that will let you pretend you aren't drowning in self-loathing for another week. Crawl into this dark hole where you belong. I love it. Every time Elizabeth goes out after she activates the substance, she does everything in her power to not be seen. Sunglasses, scarves, but also this bright yellow coat. And I struggled with this coat for a while. Like, why? It's such an intentional wardrobe choice. Why would you wear such an eye-catching piece of clothing if you don't want anyone to look at you? And that's the rub. That's where it is. She does want people to look at her. She craves validation and attention, and for people to see her and tell her that she is worthy of love, that she has value. But at the same time, she hates herself and is falling into a deeper and deeper into this pit of self-loathing that she can't bring herself to not conceal her wrinkles and her age spots and her body. So the yellow coat is, to me, showing us this internal struggle and desire to be seen, but also not want to be perceived at the same time. The food is sometimes more disgusting than the actual body horror. I don't think we ever see Sue eat. And you can't ignore that her whole career is based on being a fitness instructor. Now, no one can ever accuse Demi Moore of being fat, or even a little bit overweight. But showing her desperately demolishing unhealthy food in extreme greasy close-up is both gross and a very obvious way to communicate her mental collapse. It's also super relatable. Not so much when she goes on her whole French food cooking bender, but the first time she decides to stay home and eat junk food and watch crappy TV instead of go out into the world, it's just so sad and also so very real. And I looked at that tray of food and was just like, oh, mood, been there so many times. And the loathing that Sue expresses towards Elizabeth, towards herself, when she's reminded of her bender, hits really hard. It's giving, I am a gross, disgusting pig who does not deserve love. I don't really think that you can really talk about this issue without addressing how food fits into it. And this isn't a story about eating disorders, but you don't have to have an ED to struggle with your relationship with food and how it affects your body, especially as you get older. Who on earth brings their child to a New Year's Eve show featuring topless backup dancers? Someone who's trying to show you how this cycle carries on throughout generations. That's who. The little girl in the audience is shown for the briefest moment, but she's wearing the same outfit as Sue and is so excited to see Sue and obviously idolizes Sue. The young girl is idolizing the young woman who has been spoon-fed to her in a very specific way, just in case anyone was unclear how this whole problem perpetuates itself. This movie jumps the shark in the last act. The tone shifts really dramatically. I went from horrified and squirming to just laughing hysterically, and honestly, I really do think it worked. The movie had surreal and absurdist aspects to its style throughout, and so the tipping over the edge into full-on surrealism didn't ruin it for me. It didn't feel like it came wholly out of nowhere. I do feel like I would have preferred a different ending tonally. I didn't really expect a different ending narratively. Elizabeth wasn't ever going to come back from this. That was obvious, and I didn't expect her to. But it got a little bit too absurd, even from me near the end. That being said, it did things I did not expect, and I really enjoyed myself, even as I acknowledged that it was too much and went on for maybe a little bit too long. It wasn't a mystery that she was going to fall apart, mentally and physically, during the New Year's Eve show. That was extremely obvious, right? But I certainly didn't expect her to go full monster mode, make a paper mask out of Elizabeth's face, and vomit a whole ass titty on stage. And the audience reaction was similarly over the top. The immediate homicidal horror the audience expressed wasn't at all realistic. But we left realism entirely behind 15 minutes ago. So props to that. It's proof that you can take a very stereotypical and obviously telegraphed ending and still manage to turn it into something surprising for your viewers. There are no new stories, but there are new ways to tell old stories. So that was the substance. I am obsessed. It was very, very obvious to me that this was a movie written and directed by a woman, and I love that. There is very little I did not like about this movie, but I know some people genuinely hated it, so tell me what you thought about it in the comments below. I love discussing movies, and I love hearing other people's takes. If you think any of my takes just missed the mark and you disagree, even if you loved it or hated it or whatever, let me know. Let's talk about it. And until then, I will see you in the next one.